Hello, my name is Stephen John Campbell, and I'm here in Baltimore. We're near my place of work, which is Johns Hopkins University, and I'm on the faculty of the Department of History of Art.
From David Zwirner, this is Dialogues, a podcast about artists and the way they think.
I would say my critique of these spectacles, these Da Vinci worlds, which include TV documentaries, movies, etc., is that they seem to mainly gratify our own cultural obsessions with tech entrepreneurism, the tech innovator, and we want Leonardo to be some kind of tech innovator.
I'm Helen Molesworth, your host for this season. Every episode features a conversation with artists, curators, writers, designers, philosophers, filmmakers, and musicians about what it means to make things today. Hey, everybody. I'm so excited to be back with a new season of Dialogues, bringing you a new slate of thoughtful conversations about art and culture. We're launching this season with an interview with art historian Stephen J. Campbell. His new book on Leonardo da Vinci dismantles the myth of the solitary genius while taking on just exactly why this artist has enjoyed global name recognition for over 5 centuries. I love me some good old-fashioned art history, and I suspect some of you out there do too. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and as always, thanks for listening. Stephen, thank you so much for doing this. Here we are in 2026, and Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519. That's over 500 years ago. And somehow he is still the world's most famous artist. And in addition to works like The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa, we know that he left behind nearly 7,000 pages of drawings, notes, diary entries. And this actually far outstrips what we know of his actual, sort of full-blown artistic production. I confess, even though I thought I knew a lot, I didn't know there were only 25 extant works. And I recently went to Rome, and there's no Leonardo in Rome. And there's just a lot about this dude that I didn't know. And I wonder if you'd just set the table a little bit for us, and then we'll dive into some of the stuff in your book.
All right. First, Helen, a small correction. If you go to the Vatican, there is a Leonardo. There is a Saint Jerome. It's sort of probably fairly early from about the 1480s. It's largely an underpainting.
I didn't go to the Vatican. We only went to the Sistine Chapel. Is it always on view?
It went to the Louvre for the exhibition, and then Carmen Bambach got it as a focus show at the Met just before the pandemic. As the Met's own Leonardo kind of celebration. If you wander into the Pinacoteca in the Vatican, which a lot of people miss, it's this kind of ponderous, offshoot of the. I was just there last week, several days ago, and it's on the wall, and it connects very interestingly with Leonardo's drawings of the human anatomy, of the human skull. For instance, you got this old man with this bald skull, and astonishing attention to the structure of the shoulder. You see the gravity of flesh on aging bones and all the kind of ligaments of the neck and shoulder muscle. Carmen thinks that it was probably repainted at a later stage when Leonardo was doing his actual hands-on dissections at the University of Pavia in the 1500s, but dating from the 1480s. Yes.
But tell us a little bit about him. I know he was, for instance, in the Renaissance language, he was a bastard.
Yes, illegitimate. And so that is the first stage at which we find Leonardo's traces being covered. It's not something that is broadcast. It's known to his biographers in the 16th century. It is something of an inhibition should he have wanted to pursue his father's calling as a notary. You would get a dispensation, but I think he showed very little inclination for that kind of mercantile legal practice. Raised in the countryside, raised by an uncle, apparently, to whom he was close, from whom he receives a legacy. He is the son of his father's teenage mistress, who has recently been identified as possibly a slave, an enslaved person from the Crimea. And so Professor Carla Vecchi in Rome has written a new basically a biography. I contest the idea that a Leonardo biography is possible, but because of this possible discovery, which has a certain amount of deniability, because the name of this person was Caterina. She was emancipated by Leonardo's father not long after Leonardo is born. Caterina, however, is a generic name for enslaved people. So we do not know if that Caterina was the same as this Caterina. We have so little to go on in terms of Leonardo's early life. We have 4 facts about Leonardo before he's reached the age of 20. So, for instance, what do we hear about him then? He matriculates in the Guild in Florence. In 1476, we know he's in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, an astonishing artistic polymath. There was a fantastic exhibition about him a few years ago at the National Gallery in Washington, making all kinds of things, paintings, sculptures, bells, metallurgical operations, cannons even. And the record of Leonardo in Verrocchio's studio is interesting because in the form of a legal charge of sodomy, of being accused of sodomy with...
Leonardo is accused of sodomy.
Leonardo is accused of sodomy along with several Florentine acquaintances who basically have a better pedigree in the sense that they're not illegitimate and they're extremely well connected. One of them is a relative of the Medici. And it's thought that this is the reason why those charges are ultimately dropped. There's 2 kind of stigmata against Leonardo already. There's the stigma of illegitimacy and the stigma of this charge of sodomy. Having said that, 4 out of 5 men under 30 were prosecuted for sodomy in Florence. It's just this Florentine thing. To the extent that the word Florentine came to mean sodomite in Italy because of the organization of male culture, men marrying very young, the way masculine culture structured itself in terms of, I suppose, neighborhood associations of youths where younger men, hazed. And I guess it's like English public schools. They say this generational kind of exploitation of one group of boys by another group of boys.
Should we tell our audience that you're Irish?
I am Irish. I never went to an English public school.
Okay.
Unfortunately, so I'm bereft of all these kind of wonderful experiences. Yeah. The friars, the preachers used to harangue the Florentines of this infamous reputation for sodomy. So it doesn't make Leonardo especially extraordinary. It's probably a social inhibition in various ways because he's vulnerable, being a craftsman and being an illegitimate scion of a good, solid middle-class house. But it doesn't mean, for instance, that our notion of Leonardo, Freud's idea of Leonardo as a kind of sublimating homosexual who fits the pathologies of Freud's own patients. This is the rather amazing and rather beautiful book that Freud writes about Leonardo in 1910. I think thereabouts. I may be out on the precise date. But Freud's key text is the publication in the 1890s of the deposition against Leonardo and friends for this sexual crime.
Might I ask, why in the 1890s are people publishing a deposition against Leonardo? What's going on there that would create that to happen?
Some think the 1890s was a fun decade. It was the end of a century, and where all kinds of ways of rethinking the notions of binary sexual identities are up in the air, not just in Vienna, but so even in Italy. There is also a sort of culture of biography where everything about an artist is now, a biographical subject is now relevant. So it seems apparent that this document would have been known to earlier scholars, but they would have refrained from mentioning it because it was indecent or cast their subject in an unfavorable light. Yeah.
So you start your book not at the beginning with Leonardo's birth and childhood, but rather your book begins with you talking about what you call Da Vinci worlds. And it's really in many ways, it's as much a chapter about contemporary museum culture as it is about Leonardo da Vinci. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about this term and what it means to you and give us the argument of the first chapter in a nutshell.
Da Vinci worlds, they are an array of media in which I would include museums, right? But it's not just museums. I would say they go with the notion of experience, the idea that going to a museum has to be an experience, like playing a video game, a mediated experience, a spectacle, in other words, that's supposed to be on some level educational, but with educational through something immersive, right? But I would say my critique of these spectacles, these Da Vinci worlds, which include TV documentaries, movies, etc., is that they seem to mainly gratify our own cultural obsessions with tech entrepreneurism, with robots, neurobiology, AI, and then the idea that science can explain things like artistic creativity. It is very much our 21st century obsessions with the tech innovator, and we want Leonardo to be some kind of tech innovator. Often these are non-profit, but increasingly public museums are reshaping themselves in the same way with immersive experiences. We have a number of private and for-profit entities that call themselves museums, like the Leonardo da Vinci Experience, which is a franchise. We have a museum opening in Pueblo, Colorado, which has no Leonardo content whatsoever, except for interactive exhibitions and life-size replicas based on Leonardo's drawings and sketches. And it's devoted entirely to science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics. So your listeners are probably all aware of the morphology from STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, to STEAM, which is a rather unfortunate vaporist designation of science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics. But it's also explicitly devoted to tourism and to economic development of the area. Now, Leonardo has no connection whatsoever that I know of with Pueblo, but this is exactly what I mean by a Da Vinci world. It's a construction of Leonardo that, in the interest of a particular enterprise and a particular set of very 21st century first world problems. Is that wrong? I try to lay out like both sides of the issue, and I ultimately think it does a kind of violence to a historical subject, and I actually increasingly call it a delicate historical environment. Yeah,
I know exactly what you mean, and I had read your book before. I was fortunate enough. We went to Italy to see the Fra Angelico retrospective or show.
Good.
Yes, yeah. I'm assuming if you were just in Rome, perhaps you saw it as well. And we went to Venice, where I think I'm correct in saying there is no Leonardo.
There is the famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man.
Oh, and where is that? Is that on public view, though?
That's in the Accademia. But it's seldom on show.
Okay. So we're in Venice and we're walking around and there's a great big quote unquote Leonardo show in some fabulous palazzo. And I thought, there it is. Da Vinci World. Knowing that there could not be anything quote unquote real of Da Vinci in said show. And yet, of course, there was a line outside of people to go in. And I wondered, what does this mean that he is the most famous artist in the world, one of them, and people see shows of his that don't contain any of his actual work?
I don't know. It's like the NFT phenomenon. We don't actually have to have a content. It's because of a certain kind of brand. Leonardo is a brand. And you can brand anything, even some kind of utterly inauthentic simulacrum of the mind of an 15th century painter inventor. I think this is what it's pointing us towards, the sort of virtualization of everything. This is like the internet gone into real space, or the virtual reality of science fiction, of Assassin's Creed, for instance, turned into real space.
One of the things I was really interested in your book is because you take a very cautious account of biography. So even though we actually have reams of archival material from Leonardo's own hand, you're very tenuous about what people have done with all of that material. And I guess I have a couple of questions. One, first is, why are there so many biographies of Leonardo? It's an extraordinary bibliography. And maybe I'll start with that. Why do you think there are so many? And then I have two sort of sub-questions I want to ask you about that.
I think because the state of knowledge of Leonardo, despite the 7,000 pages of notes, is so lacunose. There's so many gaps, and I've just decided I'm interested in the gaps. I'm not filling in the gaps. I think the gaps tell us a lot. By what counted as a life, as adding up to a life 500 years ago, as opposed to the romantic and modern biography, the presidential biography, the romantic biography, and so on. So it raises questions about the difference in ideas of selfhood between then and now. The introspective confessional self, the psychological self, that does not exist for the likes of Leonardo da Vinci. That lack of information, those gaps, are seen in terms of an enigma, hence the Da Vinci Code, etc. There is a mystery out there waiting to be solved. I say there's no mystery whatsoever. It's just an understandable state of affairs for somebody in Leonardo's circumstances.
One of the things that you talk about is the way in which these biographies tend to recast Leonardo in the language of the contemporaneity of the writer. So in the 19th century, he's a romantic artist. And now in the 21st century, he's like a tech bro. He's like Elon Musk, Alain avant la lettre, or something like that. And I'm curious what it is about this, what we might call intensely projective force of the present back onto Leonardo as a subject. Is there something about Leonardo that engenders that? Or is that something about the pull of the biography of the artist in general?
I'm not sure that other biographies of artists are about projecting ourselves onto the past. I think they might be to some extent. But we don't have the same kind of biographical obsession with any other figure from Leonardo's epoch. Machiavelli, maybe, a contemporary, possibly acquaintance of Leonardo. A lot of work on Machiavelli, because Machiavelli is like this dark premonition of our present dystopian reality. He lives through his own dystopian reality, which makes him make connections, causes him to make connections, which seem very valid today. Patrick Boucheron has written brilliantly about this on Machiavelli. But I guess we just want to locate some version of ourselves back in the past. And biography has become the most effective means of doing that.
And one of the things that interests me, perhaps this is my own prejudice about the Walter Isaacson, is the way in which the discipline of art history in some ways has roots in the biographical structure. Vasari writes The Lives of Artists, and this is a sort of foundational text for the discipline of art history.
Yeah.
And as someone who has worked intimately with contemporary artists, I can no longer hold apart what I know about them as people and my visits to the studio, and I know what they're listening to on the radio. And it's powerful to not separate biography and the work. But there's something about the more recent biographies of Leonardo that do like really make him into this tech bro that just I'm bewildered by it. And I sense in some ways in the book, you're a little bewildered by this impulse as well.
Yeah. Because it's actually failing to actually look at the paintings as other than illustrations of a life. Whereas those paintings are strange and wonderful objects. So many of the writings and drawings. It's a way of creating this a priori where we know what those mean in advance. And we make incredibly arrogant claims to know what those things all amount to. It's that kind of high-handedness that makes Leonardo overfamiliar, that suppresses the interesting and edgy qualities of the work and the writing. Now, I absolutely agree with you on the sense that if we did know more about Leonardo, I think the sodomy trial is not nothing, but it's very hard to imagine what that means for somebody in Leonardo's situation. We just don't have anything else to hang it on. I'm reading John Berger with my undergraduates, and the very first chapter in that is about Seymour Clive's monograph on Franz Hals and the kind of repression of any kind of biographical account of the late Franz Hals in his 80s, starving and depending on the benefactions of the regents and the regentesses that he's called upon to paint. And Berger saying, what is wrong with imagining ourselves in Franz Halse's shoes at that moment when he has to do that. We
Right.
don't have that corresponding understanding of Leonardo that would give us access to his work, I would say. And I talk about moments of autobiographical revelation in those 7,000 pages are minimal. Is that because he's covering his tracks? No, I think he just didn't see it as relevant. Michelangelo tells us a lot about himself. Michelangelo, on the other hand, is laying claim to a poetic subjectivity and a poetic form of creativity. He identifies as a poet, like Dante does. And that is
Right.
all about a certain kind of confessional and visionary and often, frankly, abject and amorous foregrounding of the self. But Leonardo has deliberately defines himself against the literary personation of any kind.
Because
As
he's
with most
rivalrous
artists of
with Michelangelo, isn't he, Leonardo?
He is. That, of course, and we only know about this at third hand, from third parties, I should say. Leonardo writes sneeringly about the kind of classicizing hyperbolic masculine bodies that some artists feel incumbent upon themselves to produce. Considering that he's in Rome for part of his career, he's very unresponsive to the new sensational signature works of sculpture that come out of the ground in the presence of Michelangelo and other artists in Rome. No, why doesn't Leonardo ever look at the Laocoon, for instance?
Right.
Considering his interest in pathos and in the physiology of pain, for instance,
Right.
it's just a deliberate turning away. Maybe, again, this has been done by some biographers, setting up this rivalry, but there's, again, it's inference. Michelangelo is reported fairly reliably as openly dissing Leonardo as somebody who doesn't finish things. And
Right.
that gets into the official posthumous biographies of Leonardo in a kind of destructive way, feeding modern notions of Leonardo as having attention deficit disorder, being a procrastinator. Not that at all. It's a much more tangible dimension to Leonardo's professional situation, which is that his patrons keep dying or his patrons keep running out of town through violent regime change anywhere Leonardo's ever working,
Right.
including in Rome.
So if we pivot then a little bit to the 25 or so extant works, what do you think? One, I guess I'm curious, why are there so few, given how much Michelangelo there is, or Fra Angelico there is, or even Vermeer has got more works than Leonardo, it turns out. Why are there so few? And what do you think can be gleaned? Like, if the biographical record is so porous, open, absent, what is left in the actual record of the works then? What do you take from those 25 or so extant works?
This is an excellent question. On the issue of why there are so few is because the challenge that Leonardo sets himself by producing an oil painting on panel with, I think it is fair to say, a revolutionary approach in using the oil medium is incredibly exacting and time consuming. He tries to train assistants to act as collaborators or essentially as extensions of himself. We have, for instance, paintings like the Madonna of the Yarnwriter, which are Leonardo paintings that are probably not painted by Leonardo. His pictorial enterprise is ultimately less important to him. It's a way of making money than other projects. He is employed as an engineer, as an inspector of fortifications, as an architect, and as a bombardier. He's in charge of munitions in the Vatican, for instance, at the Castle of Sant'Angelo. So he's got a whole cluster of other professional responsibilities, and he seems just far more engaged. By the time he's written this treatise on painting, I think everything he was curious about that he could be done on the field of painting, he had resolved it. He was into a form of slow painting that was ultimately against the practice of the market at the time. Fra Angelico delivers altarpieces according to contract for the honor of himself and his order, absolutely, when they are due.
Right.
And
But he's interested in other things.
yes, the painting becomes a vehicle for these other interests in light, interest in how pigment can translate light, atmosphere, the vitality of living things, bodies, plants, and the world itself. And there's a point at which painting can no longer contain all those interests. They overflow what the painting can do. We see that in particular in the two versions of the Virgin and Child in St. Anne. They are essays in hyperbolic vitality.
Do you think ultimately the most famous artist in the world was somewhat skeptical of representation?
I think he really believed in the potential of representation. It's a way in which human beings can be like God, can understand divinity in nature by think through nature as a machine in which that some first mover has activated. Seeing the connectedness in nature and Leonardo's study of nature, and this is to be extrapolated from the notebooks, absolutely, this is all susceptible to representation. It is probably the strongest affirmation of the powers of visual representation that we will find, I think, even for the past 500 years.
The last question I had for you, because I found it just so interesting in the book, you make really interesting arguments about Leonardo and the role of artisans or the artisanal culture of Florence and Milan, particularly. And I wonder, as opposed to, you make arguments where they're not binaristic, but forgive the simplification here, that there's this artisanal culture and then there's academic or academicians. These are two different bodies of people that have different practices of knowledge production. And that you argue that Leonardo is really interested in this artisanal form of knowledge production. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that and why you think he was interested in that form of thinking and theorizing rather than the much more, the polish of the academician.
I think he believes in knowledge that's worthy of philosophical attention, that is to say, of intellectual attention that's achieved hands-on. Now, his understanding of Aristotle, he has certain kinds of access to Aristotle through translations and so on. Empirical knowledge is something to be affirmed. It is something that to be embraced. But then he's pushing against a certain kind of Aristotle by rote, Aristotle that's only from the books, without any kind of commerce with the physical world, animate or inanimate. He definitely wants the respectability of a humanist or an academic, but he's laying claim to a command of another body of knowledge, reading from nature, from matter.
And do you think then, and maybe this is my projection now onto Leonardo, is he invested in the observational as a way to get to the theoretical, as opposed to the theoretical as a way to understand what is observed? I'm curious about him as trying to somehow create a relay between these very different types of ways that humans make sense of things.
He's using the empirical to test propositions, and propositions from, say, Galen and from Aristotle on the nature of the human body. And we can see a definite sort of curve or trajectory in the course of his career in terms of his understanding of what the brain and the heart do, what the spinal column is for, this kind of thing, how human generation, reproduction actually works. So it's usually going with something that the schoolmen will say, what the books will say. And then he says, now I can tell you from my observation that this human spinal column has nothing to do with the transport of sperm.
Oh, thank God.
Yes, I know. So, I think it is a process of verification, of proving, of disproving in that sense.
One of the things I thought about reading the book, because I am involved with contemporary artists, and I know that they are very concerned often with their legacy. And we live in, as Derrida taught us, a kind of archive fever. If you were to be asked by a contemporary artist, what do you think I should do? What do I leave behind so that the biographers and the art historians of the future know what I was up to?
I think that there was a definite hope or aspiration on Leonardo's part that the paper, all that work, all those notes on paper, all those drafts would be cared for and would be drawn upon by others. And I think the pathos really is here that the person he entrusted with this challenge was Francesco Melzi, an artist he trained, also a young aristocrat. And Melzi just, I think, was constantly frustrated by his various attempts to organize this archive. I don't know. What does an artist do now? What does a writer do now? I have a friend who's made a sort of unofficial career about helping artists and writers to sell their papers to American university libraries.
Right.
You're conserving the work and you're making it available for others. I think that's fine. Maybe you might want to get rid of your email. I don't know. Okay, so let me just, if I can briefly mention an earlier project I worked on concerning Isabella d'Este, who's one of the most famous Renaissance women. She gets to stand for the figure of the Renaissance woman. People constantly, including Walter Isaacson, by the way, make fun of her and say these incredibly demeaning things about her because every scrap of her personal correspondence has been preserved. And it has been sampled and cherry-picked to make her look demanding, like the voracious collector. All this heavily gendered language that she was this imperious lady, just commanding people. In that sense, she was no different from most other Renaissance patrons, sense of entitlement, etc. She's just got the misfortune to be better documented. But I guess we have to be somewhat circumspect about what we leave behind us.
Burn the letters.
The emails will never go away. The Instagrams, etc., do they ever actually go away?
Right. And maybe also that there's very little one can do to control one's reception. Truly, I think I'm a Duchampian by nature, I think. And I think Duchamp understood there was very little. People would say what they would, and that would be what the work ended up meaning.
Yeah. And he could just play chess.
Might I, as a Duchampian, just ask you, what's your read of Duchamp's LL Ashoku about Leonardo's most famous painting, the Mona Lisa?
It comes at a point of nausea about early phases of the Da Vinci worlds. It's a kind of rejection. There's like a sense of suddenly everybody's paying attention to the Mona Lisa. But Malevich and Duchamp have this reaction of cancelling or making a transgressive appropriation of the Mona Lisa. Duchamp would also probably be aware of the sensational, juicy trial information. That's why he makes the trans Mona Lisa.
Right.
With the mustache and so on.
I've always been a little curious about it, but I think that your sense that Duchamp's interference with the Mona Lisa is a kind of early critique of Da Vinci world is that's spot on. And it rhymes as well with our understanding of Duchamp, or artists' understanding of Duchamp, as a kind of early progenitor of institutional critique, and really understanding that context makes meaning and that it is never generic or benign. And to me, this schoolboy humor, you recast that schoolboy humor into something a little more pointed by saying he's flagging a problem about reception and context. And that tracks for me.
Yeah, and for me too. That's absolutely right for me.
Stephen, thanks so much. Thanks for writing this just really great against the grain book on Leonardo. I loved reading it. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen. It's fun talking about it.
Dialogues is produced by David Zwirner. If you like this episode, please follow, rate, and review us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It really does help the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you join us here next time.